What if the land we call America didn't begin the way most people imagine? What if the story you learned is only part of the truth? Because long before skyscrapers, highways, and cities lit up the night sky, there was a completely different world here. And what happened over the next 400 years didn't just build a nation, it transformed an entire continent. But the real question is, what exactly was lost and what was created in its place? Most people think they understand how America began. A voyage in 1492. Colonies, independence, growth, a straightforward story. But history is rarely that simple, because behind that familiar timeline lies a deeper, more complicated transformation. One that reshaped landscapes, cultures, and lives in ways that are still unfolding today. A story of expansion, but also displacement, of innovation, but also conflict, and of decisions that continue to shape the modern world. To understand America as it is today, we have to go back to a time before it even existed. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories behind world history, subscribe to Hidden History, where the past is never quite what it seems. Before 1492, North America was not an empty land. It was alive. Vast forests stretched across the continent. Rivers flowed untouched. And across this landscape lived millions of people. Diverse, complex societies with their own cultures, languages, and systems of life. These were not isolated groups. They were nations. Some built cities. Others lived in mobile communities, deeply connected to the land. Trade routes stretched for thousands of miles. Knowledge passed through generations of agriculture, astronomy, medicine. Well, this was not a new world. It was an ancient one. Then, in 1492, something changed. A voyage across the Atlantic, led by Christopher Columbus, connected two worlds that had been separate for thousands of years. But this wasn't just a meeting. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. Exploration turned into expansion. Expansion turned into settlement. And settlement would soon lead to transformation on a scale no one could have predicted. European powers, Spain, France, and later Britain, began to arrive. At first, these were small footholds, outposts on distant shores, but over time, they grew. By the 1600s, British colonies began to take hold along the eastern coast. At first, survival was uncertain. Harsh winters, limited supplies, unfamiliar land. But slowly, these settlements stabilized. They adapted, they expanded. And with each passing decade, something began to shift. Land that had once been shared or stewarded in different ways was now being claimed, divided, and owned. New systems replaced old ones. Agriculture expanded, trade intensified, and populations grew. What began as scattered colonies was becoming something larger. Then came a moment that would redefine everything. 1776. 13 colonies, once part of a distant empire, declared independence. The United States was born, a new nation built on ideas that were revolutionary for their time: liberty, self-governance, opportunity. But even in this moment of creation, there were contradictions, because the land was still inhabited. The transformation was far from complete, and the future of this new nation was uncertain. In the decades that followed, America began to grow. Westward expansion accelerated. New territories were explored. Settlements spread across vast distances. Railroads connected regions that once felt worlds apart. Industries emerged. Cities began to rise. And with each step forward, the country became more powerful, more connected, more complex. But growth came with consequences. And beneath the surface of progress, tensions were building, because not everyone experienced this transformation in the same way. Different visions of the future collided. Economic systems clashed, social structures were tested, and as the nation expanded, the question of what America would become grew more urgent. This tension would eventually lead to one of the most defining moments in American history, a crisis that would reshape the country forever. By the mid-1800s, the United States stood at a crossroads. It had grown rapidly, expanded across the continent, built the foundations of a powerful nation. But internally, it was beginning to fracture, and what happened next would not only determine the future of America, it would change the direction of its entire story. Because the nation was about to face a conflict that would test everything it claimed to stand for. And once it began, there would be no turning back. In 1861, that tension finally broke. What had been building quietly beneath the surface for decades, differences in economic systems, regional identities, and competing visions of the future, suddenly erupted into open conflict. States separated, lines were drawn, and across the country, the people were forced to choose sides. Communities that had once lived side by side now stood divided. Families, in some cases, found themselves on opposite ends of the same conflict. This was no longer a political disagreement. It had become a defining moment, a moment that would determine whether the United States would remain one nation or fracture permanently. But even as the conflict unfolded, one deeper question lingered beneath everything. What kind of nation would emerge if it survived at all? The years that followed reshaped the country in ways few could have imagined. The scale of the conflict changed how Americans understood unity, authority, and national identity. The idea of a single, unified country, something that had once been uncertain, began to solidify through struggle. And when the conflict finally came to an end, the United States was no longer the same. The balance of power had shifted. The role of the federal government had expanded, and the foundation of the nation had been redefined. But even as one crisis ended, another transformation was already beginning, because the country was about to move into an era driven not by conflict, but by acceleration. In the late 1800s, something remarkable began to happen. The pace of change increased dramatically. Railroads stretched across the continent, linking distant regions into a single, connected system. What once took months to travel could now be crossed in days. Goods, people, and ideas began to move faster than ever before. At the same time, factories rose across cities. Production scaled to levels never seen before. The machines replaced manual labor in many industries, and a new kind of economy began to take shape, one based not just on land, but on output, on efficiency, on growth. Cities expanded rapidly, skylines began to form, and waves of newcomers arrived, bringing with them different languages, traditions, and perspectives. This was a period of opportunity, but also of adjustment. Because not everyone experienced this rapid transformation in the same way. Some prospered. Others struggled to find their place in an increasingly complex system. And once again, the question of what America was becoming remained open. With this rapid growth came something few had fully anticipated. The country was no longer just expanding geographically, it was evolving structurally. Systems of business, labor, and governance became more interconnected. Decisions made in one part of the country began to affect distant regions, and the scale of influence increased. What had once been a collection of regions was becoming a single, powerful network. But this new level of connection also introduced new pressures. Economic cycles became more pronounced. Urban life introduced new challenges. And the balance between opportunity and stability became more difficult to maintain. Still, the momentum continued, because America was no longer just growing, it was accelerating. By the early 20th century, the transformation had reached a new phase. The United States was no longer focused only on internal development. It had begun to play a role beyond its borders. Its economy had expanded, its industrial output had increased, and its presence on the global stage became more visible. The events unfolding around the world began to involve the United States more directly. Moments that would test not just its strength, but its identity. Because now, the question was no longer just, what kind of nation is America internally? But also, what role will it play in the wider world? As decades passed, the nature of power itself began to change. It was no longer defined only by land or resources. It became tied to innovation, to technology, to influence. New inventions reshaped daily life. Communication became faster, information spread more widely, and the distance between people, once measured in months of travel, began to shrink dramatically. This created a new kind of society, one that was more connected than ever before, but also more complex, because with increased connection came increased responsibility, and with increased influence came increased scrutiny. If you could observe the land itself across these centuries, the transformation would be almost unrecognizable. What began as vast stretches of natural terrain gradually became structured, organized, and developed. Roads carved paths across mountains and plains. Bridges connected regions separated by water. Cities rose upward, reshaping the horizon. Lights replaced darkness, and systems replaced open space. This wasn't a single event. It was a continuous process, a layering of decisions over time, each generation building upon what came before, until the landscape itself told a story of change. But beneath all of this transformation, industrial, technological, geographic, there was something deeper, a human story. Because every shift in history is ultimately experienced by people, by individuals adapting to new realities, by communities adjusting to change, by generations trying to understand the world they inherited. For some, these changes brought opportunity. For others, they brought uncertainty. And for many, they brought both at the same time. This is what makes history complex, because it is never just one story. It is many stories happening at once, intersecting, overlapping, evolving. And now, we return to the question that started it all. What exactly changed over these 400 years? Because when you look at modern America, the cities, the infrastructure, the global influence, it can feel like a completely separate world from what existed centuries ago. But in reality, it is the result of everything that came before. Every decision, every movement, every turning point. Each one adding another layer to the story. And yet, despite all of this change, some questions remain surprisingly similar. Questions about identity, about direction, about the balance between growth and stability. Today, the United States stands as one of the most influential nations in the world. Its cities are centers of innovation. Its culture reaches across continents. Its decisions shape global conversations. But understanding how it reached this point requires more than just knowing key dates or major events. It requires understanding the process, the gradual transformation that took place over centuries. Because many of the systems, structures, and ideas that exist today did not appear suddenly. They evolved, and they continue to evolve, even now. If you could stand in one place and watch time move forward across 4 centuries, you would see something extraordinary. A landscape changing, a society forming, a nation emerging, not in a straight line, but through moments of uncertainty, adjustment, and transformation. And perhaps that is the most important realization, that history is not a fixed story. It is a process, one that is constantly unfolding. The world we see today did not appear overnight. It was built gradually, shaped by countless moments, some well-known, others often overlooked. And while it is easy to focus on the outcome, the real story lies in the journey, in how everything changed to make that outcome possible. Because sometimes, the most important question is not just what happened, but how did it all come together? History is full of stories like this, moments when the world changed in ways few people expected. And many of those stories are still waiting to be rediscovered. If you want to explore more hidden stories behind world history, subscribe to Hidden History, because the past is never as simple as it seems.